So in my last video, we talked a lot about economics. We talked about the relative economic potential of the Western nations supporting Ukraine as opposed to Russia and how those played out in the long run. We did that not because I was seeking to find the driest possible topic to produce a PowerPoint presentation on, but because it directly informed the ability of these nations to sustain a long conflict. Today, however, we're going to, in the same vein, continue looking at the idea of what happens in the event of a long conflict in Ukraine. We're going to switch to something that may be a little bit more interesting for some, which is the questions of things that go boom. That is, what is involved in logistically and industrially furnishing the armed forces of both sides with the equipment they need to continue to conduct a conventional war. So before I jump in, where are we now, at least at time of recording? So we're bracing, the whole world seems to be bracing for a major new Russian offensive in the Donbass, either in the week of the 18th or the week of the 25th, where the Russian forces will attempt to either encircle Ukrainian forces in the joint forces area and eliminate them, or shove them out and complete the conquest of Donetsk and Luhansk. We are not, in fact, contrary to what might be popular belief, preparing for me to do a video on whether or not surface combatants are dying as a class because of the availability of anti-ship missiles. The sinking of the Moskva has occurred, but no one's about to rule navies around the world are obsolete. We're going to talk a little bit in this video about Lend-Lease, what it might mean, but more importantly, the sign that we're starting to see some NATO standard systems start to be supplied to Ukraine. At the same time, we're seeing very limited movement on the negotiation table, and with both sides preparing for a major offensive, and with the Russians no longer threatening the major center of political power in Kiev, then I don't expect there to be much movement on the negotiation table until the next phase of offensive operations plays out. A note on the upcoming offensive before we continue. Most of the comments I've received in relation to it basically focus on the prospect of Russia potentially encircling and destroying the Ukrainian forces in the joint forces area. This is circa 40,000 of Ukraine's best troops. I'm very limited in my ability to project what will happen with this offensive. I certainly have my ideas, but I'm not going to put them out there because, frankly, it's not my wheelhouse. I don't have enough information to predict what will happen. But I do have enough information to ask this question. There is reasonable reasons to say that a mobilizing Ukraine with an active supply line to the west may, as I said last video, look at a potentially victorious Russian army, even in the worst case scenario, and say no. They may say they are not willing to accept Russia's peace terms and that they're willing to fight on despite suffering a major reverse. So, in that scenario, it's quite sensible, I think, to continue exploring this question of what happens in the event of a longer conflict, particularly on the materiel front. I'm much more comfortable talking about defense economics and the military industrial sector than I am talking about what's going to actually happen on the field. And that means I have to put in a disclaimer to say that even though this video will focus on the material question, I acknowledge that material is not definitive. There are many examples of less powerful nations coming out on top of larger, more powerful nations. This is largely a result of questions of political and social will. When Ho Chi Minh said that he would lose 10 men for every one casualty inflicted on his opponent, but in the end it was his opponents that would grow tired of it, he was ultimately proven correct. It's not just what resources you have available, it's what share of your resources you're willing to dedicate, how prepared you are to lose those resources, how long you're prepared to dedicate them for, and how susceptible or vulnerable you are to requests for compromise. America's opponents have never been more powerful than it in the 20th and 21st centuries. So when America has suffered military reverses, it has not been because of an absence of material superiority. It's been because of other factors. But I and the defense industry say material is important, particularly in conventional conflict. The modern conventional battlefield, particularly the conventional battlefield, is extremely material hungry. You consume munitions and petrol and equipment at astonishing rates. And on that battlefield where you're fighting to deny your opponent control of territory or seize control of territory from him, high-tech capabilities are a significant advantage. They matter. And will can only go so far as impacting events on the ground goes. If I was to take, and as an extreme example, an impi of Zulu warriors, 10,000 men with spears and shields, straight out of the 19th century, and put them on the Ukrainian battlefield, even if they all had absolute dedication to the cause, if I put them up against some semi-motivated Russian conscripts with PKMs, AKs, and good artillery cover, that's not ending well for the attacking force of guys with spears. Materiel matters. Will goes a long way, but having the best kit certainly helps. I am going to also differentiate between materiel and capability. So it's different to have equipment as opposed to the training and support necessary to turn that into the ability to affect the battlefield. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Disclaimers put out. What am I going to cover? I'm going to do a preparatory discussion of phases of material use, that is, where do militaries pull their equipment from and in what order when they start going into a situation like wartime where they start massively increasing their consumption levels. I'm going to look at Russia's reserve and resupply capability. Then I'm going to look at Ukraine's, and in particular, the potential phases of the Western resupply effort towards Ukraine. Then I'm going to compare their comparative military industrial capacities, which only really becomes relevant in the longest of war scenarios, but I think it's interesting. So we're going to talk about it. And then I'm going to discuss potential options, the way forward for both sides. And when I say phases of material use, what I'm really saying is that where your equipment comes from changes over the course of a high-intensity conflict, at least in most cases. You start with your active deployed equipment. What did the Army's active forces in the field have on hand? How many tanks, guns, and rounds do you have forward deployed with your units? Because that's what's going to be used right at the start. As that starts to deplete, as you start to fire off ammunition, as you start to lose vehicles, things start to come from, they go by various names, but I'm going to call it the war stock. Equipment that you keep on hand, ready to serve as replacements in the event of war. It's in a high state of readiness. It's maintained well. It's either in warehouses or forward supply bases or forward caches. The US has these all over the world. And this gets deployed to make up for the requirements of equipment that is being expended in the field. You might have heard the term mothballed as another way of describing it. So this is stuff that isn't instantly ready to go. But with a little bit of refurb and a little bit of work, you can pull it out of the boneyard or the storage facility. You can make it ready, put it on a train, get it to the front, deploy it, and then it's ready to go. It's like war stock, but it takes a little bit more effort to get it ready to deploy. And then finally, there's new production. If you've exhausted all other sources, it's what's fresh from the factory. When you think about these phases, Russia's advantage is absolutely strongest in the first phase and then arguably in the deep reserve phase as well. In terms of actively deployed equipment, it had a significant advantage over Ukraine when this conflict began. A lot more deployed aircraft, a lot more deployed armoured vehicles, even a lot more deployed artillery and support weapons. Then when you start looking at the different types of reserve, it really depends on the service that you're talking about. The Russian aerospace forces are very heavily weighted towards equipment that is on active duty. Most of their aircraft are not deployed against Ukraine, but they are deployed with active squadrons. They don't have Air Force equivalents to the boneyards of Russian tanks that we'll talk about in a moment. So in terms of replacement equipment, the most probable source for Russia for aircraft that they lose deployed against Ukraine is to pull them from other active units across the Russian Federation. That has certain advantages because the equipment is likely up to serviceable standard and has paired crews, so you're likely to be able to maintain it going forward. There's fewer question marks over serviceability, although there are still some. The Army has a very different sort of situation. The Army has a lot of deployed active equipment, but it's got very, very deep reserve stocks. This is a continuation, although lesser than the old strategy of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union used to keep tremendous reserves of tanks, armoured personnel carriers, artillery, various weapon systems, and tremendous amounts of munitions in the event that there was that final all-out brawl with Western Europe, and they were going to have to go take on NATO. So the Army has a very deep reserve of equipment that we'll look at the moment. The Navy is at completely the opposite end of the spectrum, and they even deserve a little asterisk here, because the Navy is subject to a special rule. You see, once war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, and Turkey does believe this is a warlike situation, they're not really buying the special military operation shtick for the purpose of treaty, they closed the straits. And what that means, if a ship wasn't part of the Black Sea Fleet at the beginning of this conflict, it can't transfer there during the course of this conflict. So Russia can't move ships from the Pacific Fleet or the Baltic Fleet or the Northern Fleet. They can't move those ships to join the Black Sea Fleet. So unless they're willing to refloat or bring into service some of the Ukrainian vessels they've captured, or they manage to, build a new ship entirely from scratch during the conflict, the Navy is not getting reinforced even by other active duty Russian naval forces. This is one of the reasons why the loss of the Moskva hurts. She can't be replaced as long as the war continues. And then finally, there's the strategic rocket forces, who I include here just to show that I remember that they exist. If I cover the Russian nuclear forces and the Russian nuclear threats, it's going to be in its own video. It's not going to be in the context of this video. I'm going to focus on the conventional conflict that we hope that this... But if this war continues, as I said, the Russian army in particular, its endurance, its ability to continue fighting, to absorb losses, relies on its reserved equipment. And frankly, Russian storage numbers, even in their modern reduced states, are extraordinary. These are International Military Balance 2020 figures, which show that they had 10,200 tanks ostensibly in reserve, 7,000 T-72s, 3,000 T-80s, 8,500 BMP 1s and 2s, 4,000 BTRs, so a little over 12,000 vehicles to carry your blokes around. If they need fire support, well, there's 4,000 self-propelled guns and 3,000 multiple launch rocket systems, ostensibly in reserve. Most of the latter, I believe, grads. So while readiness is a big question here, like how much of this equipment is actually realistically able to be made. There have been various estimates bandied around. There's certainly lots of rumors to suggest that when the Russians pull their tanks out of storage, they've been scavenged for parts or poorly maintained, and they would require considerable rebuild. The fact remains that there's a lot of kit ostensibly in the reserve to provide some staying power. Russia has lost circa, visually confirmed, 500 tanks. If even a fraction of the 10,200 that they have in reserve can be made operational, then it's possible for them to make up their losses. There are open questions around more specialised sorts of equipment. Precision-guided munitions is the biggest asterisk, I think, on my list. That is Russia's ability to replace the stocks of the calibers and the other precision munitions that they're using, instead of having to rely on Fab 500s being dropped by their aircraft, for example. While Russia has a very large stockpile of tanks, there's a real big question over whether or not they have a significant storage of the most modern and specialised equipment. And I also attach here the question of mobilization. We haven't seen evidence that the Russians have taken the step of undergoing a general mobilization and ordering a campaign to get all these vehicles ready. We've seen some vehicles move from far-off military districts. We've seen some signs of reserved equipment, but we haven't seen evidence yet, or at least I haven't seen evidence confirmed yet, send it to me if you have it, of Russia en masse activating these older vehicles. But either way, let me be clear. There's an awful lot of Russian vehicles in reserve stock, and by contrast, Ukraine at most had hundreds of working tanks in store. International Military Balance estimated they only had a couple of hundred tanks in reserve, not 10,000. So in a protracted conflict, all else being equal, Russian endurance tied to the war reserve and, more importantly, the deep reserve stock gives them a very significant supply, at least of land material, to outlast Ukraine. But here's the problem that I identified in my previous video from the Russian perspective. Ukraine is not alone. Here I've highlighted, or rather, Wiki had highlighted nations that have sent military aid, so aid of some military utility to Ukraine. I received some complaints on my previous video saying that it was unfair comparing Russia to NATO, that the real comparison here should be Russia to Ukraine because this is just a special military operation. Or that if I insisted on including the West in these economic analyses, I should include China and India on Russia's side. It seems obvious to say, but I'll put it here. The West is being included because they have committed to supplying military articles to Ukraine. For all intents and purposes, Western military supplies are relevant to considerations of Ukraine's strength because the primary source of Ukrainian resupply, other than captured equipment from Russia, will be from Western sources. There's no evidence that China and India are supplying defense articles to Russia or are committed to sustaining it in this conflict. So yes, the storages of equipment and the military-industrial capacity of the West is deeply tied to the fate of Ukraine in this conflict. But I think the reason some people object to this analysis is because if you include the West, well, that's an issue if this war goes long, because as I've said in the past, military-industrial complex in the West go brr. It's a mammoth undertaking. The military-industrial complex of the Western powers is one of the most complex industrial conglomerations that humanity has yet conceived. I've included a graph there, which is two figures. The first is the Russian figure, which is a combination of their state defense order and estimated Russian arms exports in 2020. I'll get to those figures later. The second is NATO declared 2021 expenditure multiplied by declared expenditure share on equipment. That is, most of the defense budget doesn't get spent on new kit or equipment. It gets spent on personnel. It gets spent on basing and other activities. Most of it doesn't get spent on bling. That's the percentage that's spent on bling applied to their defense budgets, and it gives you a rough estimate. This is a very rough point of about 10 to 1 for what the NATO powers spend on equipment in 2021 versus what the Russian defense sector had to furnish in 2020. And that's relevant when we start talking about resupply and industrial capacity later on. So let's talk about resupply first. The resupply effort into Ukraine is certainly not one of a kind in the history. The US resupply of Israel during the Yom Kippur War certainly comes to mind, but it certainly has been a major effort and it has captured imaginations. It started very soon after the war began and has expanded from there. There are some limiting factors in deciding what you can supply to a stock? Do you have it on hand? If you don't have a weapon, you can't supply it. Are you willing to supply it? So are you willing to hand it over? The MiG-29s fell into this trap. They didn't go to Ukraine because no one was willing to supply them. Logistics, how quickly can you get them there? So if you have a piece of kit and it's heavy and it's hard to ship and it's in the continental United States, it's going to take a while to get there versus something you can put in a transport aircraft and fly. Usability, so how easy is it for the receiver to use it effectively? How much training do they need? And then if you don't have it in stock, how long is it going to take you to produce it? These factors all combine to determine how quickly and effectively you can resupply someone under fire. And you'll notice that a lot of these factors, for example, favor things like shoulder-fired missiles. We had thousands of them in stock in the West. They were, from a political perspective, something that was relatively simple to agree to provide. They're not considered offensive weapons by many. They're less, I suppose, intimidating than tanks or jets. They're very quiet and easy to ship, so people were willing to supply them. You could put dozens or hundreds of them in the back of a plane or in a truck and ship them relatively simply, and they didn't require much training. All these factors favor things like small arms and shoulder-fired munitions over MiG-29s and M1 Abrams. And that usability point really harps on one of the other main limiting factors that I need to call out, otherwise people are going to burn me at the stake. Equipment is not capability. Capability is, well, it's many things to many people, but it's defined here as the ability to achieve a desired operational effect in a nominated environment within a specified time and to sustain that effect. To translate this into layman's terms, if I take Yuri and his mates, we remember Yuri and his mates from the reserve video. If I take Yuri and his mates from the pub, and they're now in the Territorial Defense Force, and I give them some parachutes, a C-130, and some Kalashnikovs, Ukraine does not suddenly have a new parachute infantry capability. They do not have more airborne infantry. If I give Pavel and his friends an S-400 and all of the necessary equipment, you do not have an advanced air defense capability because they won't know how to use it. They won't know how to maintain it. Bloody hell, they might not even know how to turn it on, let alone avoid shooting their own air force out of the sky if they do figure out how to operate it. There are a lot of inputs that go into turning equipment into capability. Equipment is just one line in this fundamental inputs. It's the major systems. But it's also about having people, organization, command, training, facilities to train everyone, the suppliers and support behind it, the industry that's capable of maintaining those capabilities. So when you think about why doesn't the West just supply certain equipment right off the bat to Ukraine, it's because these other inputs would have to go along with it in order to turn that equipment into a capability and to turn it into something that's actually going to affect the field of battle. So with that in mind, let me try and break down the resupply effort into Ukraine. Let me try and explain what we're seeing so far and what we might see in the future in terms of phases. Phase 1, active deployed. Phase 2, things that are light, available, usable. Things that you can move quickly, that you have on hand, that the Ukrainians can use. Phase 3, things that are still usable, so the Ukrainians know how to use them. Most of the elements of those capability inputs are still there. The logistics, the facilities, the personnel, all those are in place. The only thing that's different from Phase 2 is the equipment is now heavy, and instead of being available, you probably have to backfill. So in order to get countries to hand it over, you need to give them something else to replace it, which adds an extra logistical challenge. Phase 4 is stuff that you might have, but those other capability inputs aren't there. They're new, and you need to put more supporting effort into getting the Ukrainians up to a standard where they can use it. And phase 5, really, it's not its own phase. It runs in parallel to all of these. It's the production effort to get the industry producing what's going to be needed in the future to make sure that by the time you use it, it's on hand and available. So let's walk through these phases as they've applied to Ukraine in detail. So phase 1, it was Kalashnikovs and Stugnas. It was the aircraft and tanks that they had as the war began, plus what Western supplies they already had been supplied. So things like the NLAW were already in Ukraine when the war began. So it was a very interesting mixture of Soviet, post-Soviet Ukrainian, and Western military hardware. Ukraine had clearly planned for this eventuality. They had planned for this war, but their supplies were ultimately limited. And when the Russian invasion started, you'll recall the first thing they asked for. The first thing they asked for was as many shoulder-fired anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons as they could get. And that led us into phase 2. Shouldering the burden. So this is the huge initial resupply where every Western power basically checked what it had in the warehouse in terms of things that you fired from your shoulder that go boom and sent them. This is the Iglas, this is the Pyoruns, this is the NLAWs, This is the Spanish anti-tank weapon systems. This is Carl Gustavs. This is Panzerfausts. This is everything that you could fire from your shoulder, teach a guy to fire in a couple of days or even hours, and could send very, very quickly. Tens of thousands of tubes coupled with thousands of small arms and millions of rounds of ammunition. So it's all stuff that's really quick to uptake. It's easy to transport. It was all held in storage. And in some cases, it was many, many years worth of production of these systems that was being pushed. When Zelensky asked for 500 javelins a day, which is something the Ukrainians did indeed ask for, to keep in mind how absolutely incredible that number is. The annual production of javelins is in the low thousands. They're talking now about pushing that production figure up to 7,000. Which is a level where even if you push it to that level, you're not going to be able to sustain someone who's claiming they need 500 javelins a day. Now, there's a lot of reasons that might go into that ask. Maybe they're not using that, but they want to stockpile them. Maybe they want a greater supply. Maybe they're asking for 500 in the hopes that they get 50. Or maybe they just want them front-loaded. But either way, the scale of this initial resupply effort was incredible. As I said, tens of thousands of missile tubes. And then the Ukrainian ask evolved, and they said, no, what we really need is heavy equipment. Still need the shoulder-fired stuff, but what we really need now is lots of heavy equipment. And this is where the race became to get them as much former Warsaw Pact and some former Yugoslav equipment that they could as quickly as possible. These are heavy systems, but they're ones which Ukraine is familiar with. They're mostly relatively close to Ukraine because they're deployed in the former Warsaw Pact countries, or they're in storage in the former Warsaw Pact countries. So it's easier to move them than, for example, from the continental United States or from the UK. And they're pretty simple systems in terms of getting them provided. What happens generally is the country agrees to provide the hardware if the United States agrees to provide NATO capabilities or NATO systems to replace them. So when the S-300 was provided, it was provided on which is that anti-aircraft missile system. It was provided on the understanding that the United States would deploy a Patriot, which is a more capable anti-aircraft missile system, to replace its capabilities and defend the area until a more permanent solution could be found. So what's happening is these nations, former Warsaw Pact and former Yugoslav countries, are pushing a lot of their Warsaw Pact era equipment, or modern equipment which is still Warsaw Pact standard, pushing it into Ukraine, usually in exchange for NATO backfill, although not in all cases. And it's not just about systems. So it's not just about T-72s from the Czechs, for example. It's also about munitions. It's about the millions of rounds of ammunition. It's about the 152mm artillery shells. It's about the 5.45mm rifle rounds. It's about 7.62 rifle rounds. It's about mortar rounds and mortar ammunition and mortar equipment. It's about all sorts of ordnance and weapon systems from that era that Ukraine is already skilled on and is already capable of using. The limitation on this phase is actually the quantities of them that are available. The former Warsaw Pact countries only have so many T-72s in storage. They only have so much old ammunition. They only have so many old weapon systems that they're capable of providing. And eventually they're going to run out, especially in cases where they're not producing new ones at any appreciable rate. I've talked before about people tend to overstate the importance of captured material, and that people assume that Ukraine has captured more working tanks than they've lost them, and they use the Oryx data in order to prove that. The reality is, even if a lot of those vehicles are not immediately operational, those are sources of ammunition, they're sources of spare parts, they're sources of that can be broken down, looted, and used to get other versions of that system operational again. So captures are very, very important in terms of making up numbers, and we have seen captured equipment go into service on both sides. We've even seen some instances where the same vehicle is lost once on both sides and is still in service at the end of it. It's quite remarkable. So this sort of phase 3, where Ukraine is mostly fighting with Warsaw Pact era stuff, it's the dominant phase at the moment. It's where we currently are. It's still ramping up because we're still not supplying, for example, Warsaw Pact era fighter jets, which is something Ukraine has continued to ask for, MiG-29 being one example. We have supplied some air missiles, though. So this is still an area of growth, but eventually it's going to run into quantity restrictions as we start to run out of this sort of. Certainly, if you just take the reserve figures, the NATO resupply capacity of this equipment is much less than the Russian reserve stocks of this equipment on paper. So that's bad news for Ukraine. Which means really, and we've started to see some small signs of this, eventually, if this war goes long, you're going to need to see a phase 4. which is as hard as it is to do, you're going to need to start transitioning Ukraine to using at least some NATO standard systems. There's a lot of limitations involved here. Training, non-common ammunition, spare parts, logistics. But most of those limitations can be overcome with time, will, and the dedication of resources. The Ukrainians are not stupid. They can learn to use new systems. New infrastructure can be put in place. Technical expertise can be introduced, either in the format of pulling Ukrainians out of the country, training them and reintroducing them, or having foreign volunteers and contractors go into Ukraine to train the Ukrainians on the systems there. So the ability to move to NATO systems is there with time. There is a sliding scale of difficulty here. Like, not all systems are created equal. And I'm a bit annoyed that this video has not been released when I initially made the slides, though, because since this video was created, the slides were created, the Americans have announced they're providing an admittedly very small number of 155mm howitzers to Ukraine, which are not Warsaw Pact era. They're NATO standard. 155mm is a NATO caliber. Most of the Soviet stuff uses 152mm. But something like a howitzer is much easier to introduce than, for example, a fighter jet. If you take some artillery gunners who understand the basic premise of how big gun work, how to aim big gun, and what can go wrong when shooting big gun, that's a lot simpler and easier to transfer them onto a system like a Western howitzer than it is to take the Ukrainian Air Force and transfer them to the bloody F-35. They need to learn how to fly it. They need to learn how to maintain it. And that's an entirely different prospect to maintaining what is still a relatively simple system when you talk about howitzers and artillery guns. So there is a sliding scale here. And what you will see go first to Ukraine is equipment that is simpler to train on and easier to adopt. Stuff that is NATO standard, but closer and requires less in terms of stand-up than other equipment. So no to F-35s, no to stuff that's in the airspace, yes to artillery, yes to armoured personnel carriers, which is basically a truck with armour on it when it comes down to it, just with different automotive maintenance requirements. The doctrine around using an armoured vehicle still exists. They just need to learn how to maintain and supply the damn thing. And I'd also leave as an open question here as a preface to some heresy I'm going to utter later. We also have to ask ourselves, are there systems where, hypothetically, it's okay if the Ukrainians only had a really basic operating capability and some volunteer support, as opposed to having an in-depth understanding of how to supply a system in every way, shape, or form? That is, are there cases where there are systems you could provide where it's enough they just know the basics, even if they have to send the thing back to the factory if it suffers serious mechanical failure? Are there systems, and I don't want to say it because I'll get in trouble, but are there hypothetically systems where it's enough that the Ukrainians are able to get it to the front line, fire off its ammunition supply, and then put it on a train and ship it back? I don't know. It's an open question. And then phase 5 is taking it to scale. This is an industrial production question. This is running in the background the whole time. It's about whether your defense sector can furnish new supplies of ammunition and equipment. It's a question of how quickly you can produce everything a military needs in a situation where it's being consumed at high-intensity warfare levels. It's a question of how much fat is there in your existing production capacity and how effectively can you scale. And because I love defense economics, we're going to talk about productive capacity now. And I will start by saying that assessing productive capacity in military-industrial complexes is hard. The starting point I'm going to use is existing standard production levels, but there are other questions that go into how far that goes. For example, most production lines are not run at full capacity all the time. You can run them faster and harder. So how much fat do you have in your existing production lines? How much faster could you run them? And when you start asking the question of, well, how hard is it to stand up additional lines or extra capacity, you start asking questions like, what's your dual-use industry and human capital base like? Because if you don't have people who are used to building that equipment, but they operate in all the relevant supporting sectors, then you've got more capacity to scale production than if you only have an industry that is basically only a defense sector. If you have a very large civilian aerospace sector, you're better positioned to scale up military aerospace production in a time of conflict than if all of the aircraft you produced were military, for example. And then what are your scale-up mechanisms? So how good is government and how good are corporations in your country at scaling up, and what mechanisms do they have available to make that process easier? I'm going to say we have to be careful here because there are lots of various measures we could use. However, I'm making a video on the internet and trying to keep it a reasonable length, so we're going to use measures that I disclose that are intended to be approximate. Please don't use these as definitive. I'm going to use 2 key sources on Russia. Congressional Research Service reports, and also the International Military Balance Report. So let's jump in and talk about the Russian defense sector first. And I'm going to say two things about the Russian defense industry right up front. The first is that it is a major national employer in Russia, and the second is it punches well above its weight in terms of its significance on the global stage compared to the size of the Russian economy. Russia is often the second largest weapon exporter in the world after the United States, which is not something that you would naturally presume given the size of its GDP. You would think China would be the second largest supplier. Failing that, someone like the UK or Germany. No, it's the Russians. So I combine two figures when I'm estimating the output of the Russian defense industry in 2020. Rough measures, as I said. The first is the state defense order. So this is basically the Russian government's order for stuff for the military. The SDO 2020 was estimated about $21 billion US dollars, and that was the ask for stuff for the armed forces. The second component I'm adding, because it's hard to ignore it when you talk about Russia, is military exports. And the Congressional Research Service released a report which estimated somewhere around 15 billion US dollars in defense exports in 2020 for the Russian defense sector. Now, people will say that that figure is overstated. The 36 billion figure is overstated. And they'll say that because not all of Russia's defense exports or production are relevant to the conflict in Ukraine. Shipbuilding, for example, is a major part of Russian defense exports. But as I said earlier, you can't move ships to the Black Sea during wartime, so they're not actually relevant to the Ukrainian conflict. But the same applies to NATO and the immense military shipbuilding capacity of the United States. And because it's hard to separate out output for naval, air, and land equipment year by year, average them and whatnot, I'm just going to include both sets of figures as an overarching defense sector figure. But for all its scale, the Russian defense sector does face pretty severe challenges. A lot of that relates to the sanctioned environment it's found itself in since 2014. Especially before 2014, the industry was extremely dependent on foreign components and machine tools. The Russians themselves acknowledged this, which is why they made it a priority to move the defense sector away from foreign components after the 2014 sanctions were imposed. That has largely been successful, but there are still areas where they are dependent on foreign machine tools, expertise, or components. The industry is also adopted to very low production rates. So, as I said in my first video on this topic, Russians tend to invent or develop relatively promising new and modern weapon systems and then have very short and very low production runs, which means the factories are configured to survive at very low production runs. So the question is, how much fat do they have there to scale up quickly? They also have workforce limitations. The workforce, particularly in Russian tank production, is quite old. That's not particularly relevant in the context of this crisis, except for insofar as there's a question over how much new blood they can bring in, how quickly, in order to ramp up production. More important is probably the fact that most of the defense sector has quite high debt level. A lot of the major defense concerns and companies have very high levels of existing debt, and that debt just got a lot more expensive when Russia hiked its interest rates to 17%, or at least it will when they eventually have to refinance. Now, you might say, well, that's not a problem, the government will just bail them out, but it just highlights the fact that this is an additional economic cost. If Russia's going to need to bail out its defense sector in order to keep it operating, then that adds to the financial cost of carrying on this war, as opposed to being able to force the defense industry to basically keep delivering, even at a loss, and wear the cost in the short run. Just to emphasize this point, people sometimes say I don't use enough Russian sources. Yuri Borisov, so he's the current Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation. He was former Deputy Defense Minister, deeply involved in the Russian defense industry, and even he admitted that the sector was living hand to mouth in previous years. In 2017, they were talking about selling fighter jets to Indonesia in exchange for barter. Coffee and palm oil for fighter jets. Now, that works, it's practical, don't get me wrong, but it's less practical than being able to just trade in dollars, and certainly highlights some of the difficulties the Russian defense sector has faced. The Russian defense sector is already subject to measures holding it up. That is, it's already in a position where measures are having to be taken to hold it up and keep it running at current productive level. In many cases, Russian government is paying 80% upfront fees. I can't imagine many businesses that would be keen ordering long lead time items and paying 80% to a supplier upfront. Obviously, there's a reason the Russian government can do it, but it shows you that there's not much give left to add. Pромsvязbank has also been involved in very actively funding the defense sector, so giving them favourable financing arrangements to make sure they're able to secure funding. But the point is that the sector requires constant infusions of money before sanctions got put in place, and now you're in a very high inflation environment that's going to punish it further. So if it's going to recapitalize, it's going to adopt to sanctions, it's going to replace its imported components, it's going to scale up. There's a question over how much money and effort is required in order to get the industry to respond, and how capable the industry is of responding to it. There's also the question of whether or not Russia can tell its foreign buyers, because Russia's got large back orders of foreign equipment that's been purchased by other powers that they're waiting on. There's a question of can they tell them to go, themselves and wait and instead divert those orders for domestic use. Can they afford to do it? Will their partners allow them to do it? Ukraine, for example, has done this. They've diverted a whole bunch of Stugna production that was meant to go to the Middle East. That's been diverted to the Ukrainian army and is being used against Russian armor. Okay, what happens if we look at NATO instead? So, like I said, you take the 2021 estimated output figures, you apply the percentages that those countries spent on equipment as opposed to other items, and you arrive at a figure of about $326 billion. Now, that will obviously vary massively year to year because the balance within defense budgets changes between how much equipment they're buying versus how much they're investing in other things. The other thing I'll say is that figure is not accounting for goods that NATO countries buy from outside NATO, and it's not accounting for exports from NATO's defense sector to countries outside NATO, which we know is a significant thing. The US, for example, sells a lot of weapons and equipment to non-NATO countries, but I decided to keep it simple, so we're using that figure. An alternative figure, you look at the Aerospace Industry Association, they estimate that there's about $382 billion of US GDP added by the defense and aerospace sector combined, so the military and civilian aviation sector, about $874 billion in revenue in 2021. There's a base of expertise in Warsaw Pact equipment in the Eastern Bloc of countries, so countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact still generally have a base of experience in operating and maintaining it. And I'm also not accounting here for non-NATO but supportive allies. So I'm not accounting for countries like Japan or the Republic of Korea. Now, when we look at this much larger defense industrial base, what happens when we ask the questions around our factors? How much fat is there in existing production lines? How much dual-use industry is there that could be converted to military use? What are the scale mechanisms like? The first point I'll say is that we know for a fact that many Western military production lines aren't at full capacity. So there's talk of Javelin production amping, potentially above 6,000, maybe as high as 7,000 missiles, whereas an economically efficient, so a cheapest possible production run would be about 3,600 per annum. Other production lines are low rate and relatively dormant, things like the Stinger, which was really just in low rate production for export orders. And that's going to take a longer period of time if you want to amp up Stinger production, for example. But all of this production operates as part of a much wider dual-use ecosystem. When you talk about the Lockheed Martins and the Boeings and the Airbuses and the various large defense primes, they're operating in the context of an American and European and NATO defense sector and civilian aerospace and relevant civilian sectors that are much, much larger than what the Russian defense sector has to work with. There's a lot more trained people in these sectors who can be employed on defense production if they need to be done. There's a lot of capital available. There's a lot of finance available. And there are mobilization tools if they become required. I don't think the United States is going to activate the Defense Production Act, but the United States, for example, has legislative frameworks in place that allow the government to direct companies to prioritize military orders over civilian applications. So if, for example, you're a firm which could either be producing chips and electronics for military use, maybe Lockheed, you're selling to Lockheed, or you could be producing for civilian purposes, the government can order you to take the Lockheed contract, essentially. So there are advantages in terms of the Western military industrial complex leveraging their much larger economy, which is why I talked about it so heavily last time, and converting that into military production as this goes on. I will say it is hard to explain just how complex and bureaucratic this mess can become. Like ordering an entirely new weapon system, a major system, from scratch, developing it to ordering it and then putting into service can be an incredibly complex process. These massive defense prime contractors can move mountains to get stuff built and delivered if enough money and priority is thrown at a problem. So in comparative terms, there is no contest. If this moves from being a war of what do you have in reserve to what can you produce, then there is a decisive advantage on the Western side of the equation because the Russian defense industry is too small, too poorly capitalized, and facing too many problems to ramp up to meet the same outputs the West is hypothetically capable of producing. Which leads to this question of what next? I think for the West, if they want to get the most out of their resupply efforts, it means a couple of things. The first is you need to start thinking long-term now. You need to start thinking not just about how to get the Ukrainians the equipment they need today, the equipment they're going to need in a month, the equipment they're going to need in a year. And there's some signs that this is happening. The big sort of sea change is going to be the passage in the US of the new Lend-Lease Act. This was something that was critical to supplying the Allies during the Second World War. And the version that's gone through the United States Senate includes some key amendments to make this easier. It removes things like the 5-year time limit and a number of other conditions that would have constrained the ability of the US to supply weapons in response to Ukrainian demands. Basically, this is going to be a giant semi-unlimited credit line for Ukraine to request US weapons, and as long as the US executive signs off, they're on their way. That's what this is likely to look like. And that means it falls to the Ukrainians to start thinking about what they might need in the long term, and you'd like to think that they're relatively well. It also means the West probably needs to internally do a little bit of soul-searching and answer its questions over escalation aversion now. The Russians have not responded with fire and brimstone to anything that the West has supplied to date, up to and including armoured vehicles. Their non-red lines have repeatedly been crossed, and the retribution has been not there. So basically, as I said in my first video, the West probably needs to decide if it's in it to win it or not, and if it's in it to win it, then the consideration of what is escalatory needs to be dropped, and the question of what Ukraine can use and what Ukraine wants and needs probably needs to take pride of place. There also needs, I think, to be courage around backfilling and temporary capability reduction. So instead of needing a replacement system to be in place before a piece of equipment is sent to Ukraine, it's probably acceptable for individual NATO countries to be a little less well defended now, as long as they know a new system is coming eventually. Because ultimately, the NATO countries benefit from Article 5. They benefit from collective defense. So there is a reason to suggest that maybe NATO does not need all of its equipment all of the time. It has a complete conventional overmatch against Russia anyway, so it should be able to afford to send some of its equipment to Ukraine before replacement systems have arrived. And again, we've seen some nations being willing to do exactly that. Then there's the questions of how to solve those capability gaps I was talking about earlier. It's not just about the equipment. It's about having a plan for solving the technical questions, the training and advisory questions, the putting physical infrastructure in place to make delivery easier. On the Ukrainian side, it's about planning for how are you going to generate the new forces to use this sort of equipment? How are you going to convert volunteers who signed up to defend Kiev in the initial stage of this conflict into new brigades of troops equipped with new equipment who can go on the offensive hypothetically in a year or so? What's your long-term plan there? So answering this goal for the West is probably as much a political as a military term, a military question rather. So what would that actually look like? And a disclaimer here that I'm talking from a logistical view rather than a military one. Never worn a uniform. But this is how, from a logistics standpoint, these are the questions I'd want answered and what it would look like. The first is you probably need a force design vision now. The Ukrainians probably need an idea of what they want their army to look like in the future. What equipment is it going to be using down the track? Where is it going to come from? What training do they need? What facilities do they need? And then having designed your future force, knowing what you're going to want down the track, long lead items need to get started. So that is, if you're going to have to produce it from scratch, or if you're going to have to ship it a really long way, or if it's something like training and expertise that takes a really long time to develop, you need to get started on that first so that eventually you can bring the whole thing together roughly at the same time and minimize the overall period until you've operationalized a capability. It's important to note here that it's easier to move people than equipment, and training times can be long. So logic would dictate doing some of what the Americans have already done, whereas you have Ukrainians outside of Ukraine for training in the United States or training in Poland, and that training can use facilities, infrastructure, and equipment that's already in place in NATO countries, and then you can send the expertise in the form of those people back to Ukraine in order to pass on that knowledge or just to operationalize that knowledge. Maybe you supplement that with foreign volunteers who have that sort of expertise and training to introduce that knowledge even more quickly. And then you want the equipment becoming available around the same time these guys are trained up and know how to operate it and can use it in an intelligent and integrated fashion. But I'm going to go a little bit further here, and as I said, spout a little bit of heresy. Capability generation, so that process of getting everything together to support a capability, is a complicated and heavily regulated process in most countries for a reason. There is a long series of decisions, consultations, and steps governments and defense sectors and militaries take, moving from the decision to design a piece of equipment to operationalizing it and actually using it in combat. That process exists for a reason. You need to make sure that you're prioritizing your cash correctly, that you're making the best use of everything you field, that you're not putting people into harm's way, ill-prepared. But in some ways, those are peacetime rules. Efficiency may not always be the goal here. So there may be situations where we need to relax our thinking a little bit. Maybe we train our people in a specific set of equipment for a year before we put it into combat. But maybe the Ukrainians will do just fine with an abbreviated training scheme. Maybe they don't need to know everything. Maybe they don't need to be able to do everything. Maybe if they know the basics of how to make the thing shoot and maneuver it and do basic levels of maintenance, maybe in some circumstances that's enough. And when making those decisions, I think it's going to be important to talk to the Ukrainians themselves to determine what they think their capabilities are, what they're getting success out of, and what they think they can use going forward. For the Russians, the next steps are much simpler. They have a massive reserve stock. The question is, how effectively can they inventory it and then go about the process of reactivating and deploying it? There doesn't seem to be, from an initial analysis, a prospect that in the long term, the Russian defense industry is going to readily be able to outsupply the Russian army relative to what the West can eventually supply Ukraine, particularly once Ukraine makes that transition to NATO standard hardware, which they will inevitably make if this conflict goes for a sufficiently long period of time. Russia's relative advantage is in the early and mid-war, where the primary source of equipment is what you already trained in using, what you already have as part of your built-in capability, that you have replacement equipment and potentially people in reserve. So Russia is to an extent on the clock. But I don't want us to forget the scale here. Just because Russia is on the clock doesn't mean they are at a disadvantage. The scale of difference in hardware on hand is so great that the war is going to have to run for a very, very long period in order for those capability gaps to resolve themselves. And in some areas like aerospace, I am pessimistic that they would ever be fully resolved. Russia has so many deployed aircraft and so many pilots that the ability of the Ukrainians to train enough pilots and get enough new aircraft that they would actually be able to be at parity is questionable. More realistic is a situation where Ukraine is able to transition and use ground-based air defense systems in order to partly neutralize the Russian Air Force. That's a more realistic scenario, for example. But my point here is that just because Ukraine gains a relative advantage as the war goes on, does not mean Russia does not enjoy extreme advantages early on, at least in terms of the equipment dimension of this conflict. The West enjoys a tremendous advantage in terms of military industry over the Russian Federation, but Russia's advantage is that Ukraine is gated by the various other fundamental inputs into capability that prevent it just picking up 1,000 M1 tanks and a bunch of F-35s and going to Moscow. That's a problem the Ukrainians face, and the Russians, for their part, have an unknown number of potentially serviceable, but potentially very large number of serviceable replacement tanks, APCs, ammunition, and various other defense articles in storage that they can foreseeably use to sustain themselves in the early to mid-war period. I'll also add this note, though, a caveat to the caveat, if you will. If Ukraine does reach the stage of this conflict where they are able to adopt NATO hardware on a long scale, then the amount of hardware that NATO holds in reserve is probably sufficient to arm them to the extent that they can sustain a conflict against Russia. The sheer number of vehicles and defense articles in NATO inventories, while not as individually impressive as Russia's ostensible 10,000 number, are generally of a higher quality, higher state of readiness, and higher capability than a lot of the Russian reserve hardware. If you can find a Leopard 2, it's probably better than a T-72A, to use an example. So if this war goes long enough and Ukraine is successful in starting to establish a capability to deploy NATO hardware, and NATO countries are willing to deploy that hardware, which something like Lend-Lease would suggest they are, then there is every possibility that Ukraine is able to endure long enough for the industrial balance to play. And if industrial balance does play, well, then there's only one direction the meter is going to go in the long term, isn't there? And now for an awkwardly cut-in addition from Future Perun. I recorded this video more than a week ago at this point. I've been editing and tinkering with it since then, and as a result, some of what I've said has been partially obsoleted by recent developments, and I wanted to insert something here just to capture some of that, to sort of build on what we were predicting would happen with some of what has happened. So these are some quick additions after the fact that have happened over the last couple of days. The first is confirmation that aircraft supply to Ukraine no longer seems to be taboo, at least for some NATO partners. We saw the US Department of Defense spokesman John Kirby come out and say that Ukraine has more operational fighter aircraft now than it did 2 weeks ago. And the reason that's the case is because some undisclosed NATO partners have provided airframes and spare parts in order to augment the Ukrainians' ability to contest their airspace with their own jets. That is a huge deal. It's another escalatory barrier that has now been crossed, and Russia has not invaded Western Europe in response. So that being said, it's now likely that more NATO allies will be willing to do the same now that they've seen that the Rubicon has been crossed. We've also seen an increasing number of NATO-type vehicles being supplied, not just Warsaw Pact ones, but NATO-standard vehicles, whether they be old or new. So equipment that we would associate with that Phase 4 of the resupply schedule, things like potentially armoured vehicles from the Netherlands, Panzerhaubitzers from Germany is being discussed, Leopards from Germany is being discussed, various armoured vehicles from countries like Australia and the United Kingdom that are definitely not Warsaw Pact hand-me-downs. The Bushmasters from Australia are in Ukraine now. These are all examples of NATO or Western-type equipment that's being put into Ukraine, even though Ukraine has no history of operating the equipment, on the assumption that they're going to be able to make some decent usage out of it. So that's things that have either been announced or things that have actually made it onto the ground. The other developments that I thought I really wanted to note were we're seeing some signs of efforts on the capability inputs front. So not just the equipment, but also making sure that Ukraine has the inputs necessary to turn that equipment into a warfighting capability. One example is the Czechs opening up their arms factories to repair and restore Ukrainian tanks that have been damaged in combat or Ukrainian tanks that are coming out of deep storage and need to be restored. This is amazing. This is excellent for Ukraine, because what this means is even if their own workshops are being attacked or at capacity, they have the ability to put those vehicles on trains, ship them to Europe, and get them repaired somewhere else. It's a bolstering of the capabilities that Ukraine has. It also means that all the know-how, the human capital that is available to the Czech arm industry or for any other NATO arms industries that open up themselves in similar ways, becomes available for the Ukrainians to access, which is a great way to leap forward the sort of capability and human capital you have. Going along with this, we're also seeing more reports of foreign experts doing training in Ukraine, of Ukrainian forces on various new systems, and we're also seeing increasing reports of Ukrainians that are currently overseas, in, for example, the United States or in Europe, receiving training in turn. Still in relatively small numbers, but we don't know what the scale is beyond what's being reported. But either way, this is an important activity. If you're going to unlock the additional capabilities in the long term, if the Ukrainians are going to learn how to operate new systems effectively, there's going to have to be a coordinated, concentrated training effort, both within Ukraine and also outside of Ukrainian territory. So it is heartening for the Ukrainians to see more of those announcements coming out. The flip side is that I still don't see much discussion of the major logistics bottlenecks that Ukraine faces being resolved. One of the great concerns I have, for example, is the amount of Western hardware that continues to pile up, according to all reports, including from people on the ground who are complaining this stuff is piling up in Western Ukraine and that it isn't being pushed to the eastern parts of the country and to the front. That's a problem that has to be resolved. It's an organizational and logistical challenge that the Ukrainians have to resolve themselves. And that has to be smoothed out if the ongoing supply of hardware from the West, including newly announced additional supports from the United States and various supports from other European powers, are going to have the maximal impact. So anyway, those are some developments that have happened over the last couple of days and weeks that I thought I would add. Other than that, I think the video holds up relatively well. I hope you've enjoyed it and you get some use out of it. Okay, so with all that said, channel update. The first thing is I am slowly clearing that email backlog. I have received a tremendous number of emails. I'm working through them as well as I can. Please be patient. I know there are some I received up to 2, even 3 weeks ago that I'm still getting to. I'm sorry. I'm clearing it inbox by inbox. I've received a huge number of offers of help, and to be honest, that help will be much appreciated given the amount of material I'm filtering through and producing these. I am looking into creating a Discord, both to allow people who follow this channel to mix and discuss, but also to allow me to coordinate those people who are offering to help. I will provide an update on that soon. I have overhauled my image, my branding. I'm looking at overhauling the Patreon too. It probably means that because of the change to the type of content we're doing here, it's important that I'm able to control my topic to make sure I don't fall afoul of any YouTube rules. So I'm probably going to remove the commissioned video tier and really move away from specific rewards and leave the Patreon mostly as something that's there to support me in this work going forward. But I will make announcements before those changes are made. You will have heard the audio has changed again. This is an ongoing effort. I am receiving assistance. I am using new hardware. I'm aware it's still not perfect. I will have specific thanks to offer to those who have helped me next time a video goes live, but I am working on it. I've also received questions from hearing impaired people about subtitles. Can I put the scripts for these videos up as subtitles? Embarrassing disclosure, I don't script these videos. These slides are what I talk to. I produce them and then I go. So in order to produce subtitles, I'd basically have to listen back to the video and scribe that down. I'm going to look for a mechanical or a better solution to that problem. But for now, it's sort of a watch this space. I'm going to rely on auto-generated for the immediate future, but I am aware of the problem and I'm looking at potential solutions. People have also said they want to see a best of propaganda, the best stuff that has come into my email inbox. I'll say this, most emails I'm getting, no matter what political opinion they're pushing, most stuff has been reasonably well argued, good quality stuff. And some has been absolute stinking propaganda that is hilarious. So yes, I am compiling a best of, and when I have enough of it, I'll put together a video with like a top 10 or something, top 10 themes of the craziest, nuttiest propaganda of the Ukraine war to date. But I want to make sure I've got enough to make a video before I do. I also get a lot of questions on basically, who am I? Who are you, Prune? What's going on? Why are you making videos in this area and why should I trust you? I understand this, I really do, given the proliferation of unreliable sources all over the place and the fact that everyone suddenly wants to comment. I also hope you'll understand why I'm a little bit coy, particularly since I started commenting on a very sensitive series of current events in a very sensitive field in terms of what I choose to put out there. I will say this, I am not in the military and I have never been in the military, so there's no uniform here. Please don't assume that I have been. The other thing I'll say is from an educational background, obviously defense economics is a lifelong passion area. I spent a long time at university. I studied military history, economics, finance, supply chain management, and a number of other fields that are directly relevant. As for once I leave university, well, I'm just going to leave that without comment, and I hope everyone's okay with that. My privacy is important to me. I'm going to give some thought as to what I can say, if anything, beyond that. But to be honest, for the moment, it just has to be like that. And at the end of the day, what I'm saying is I'm not trying to appeal to any particular authority here. Don't trust me because I'm someone special. If the argument and the sources don't make sense, challenge it. Comment on it, take it for what it is. This is YouTube. One of the most popular defense commentators out there is literally a puppet. So, that's the world we live in now. I'll think about if there's anything further I can say, but for the moment, that is where I'm going to leave it. And finally, 100,000 subscribers looks like it is around the corner. I understand that at this point, YouTube actually sends you a trophy, which, to be honest, if tomorrow the algorithm decides that I am useless and decides to get rid of me, will be a great way to remember what has been. I can't thank you enough for the support that you have shown, the fact that you watch and engage with these videos, the fact that you comment so actively. I continue to read every email and read every comment. And while I logistically cannot respond to them all, I do note them, collect them, and they do frame my discussions, and sometimes I try to bring them together in future videos. So thank you for all your engagement. It's been a heck of a ride. My thoughts, as always, go to the people who are currently engaged in the conflict in Ukraine, and my great thanks go to those people who are currently, for example, sheltering refugees in Europe and doing their best to alleviate the human side of this particular tragedy. My thoughts, as always, are with you, and I hope the same goes for those who are watching today. So thank you again all. I will return soon, and I hope you've gotten something out of today's video. Thank you very much.